yesterday's news.
Hello and welcome to Old News, the programme and podcast which looks at news stories of the day through the papers of yesterday. Unemployment this week. Been in the news again recently. Up in January, it seemed 370 unemployed people on the Isle of Man, up 25 on the December figure. Always a bone of contention, the employment figures, I think, on the island, so I thought we'd have a little look back to see how they fared. Well, if we go back to 1927, prior to that, or much prior to that, I don't think records were kept. However, in the Isle of Man Examiner of Friday, May the 13th, 1927, Mr. Sargent's scheme for unemployment, raising the school age, vocational training and unemployment insurance. The Unemployment Commission sat again this Friday morning, we are told, to take evidence from Mr. B. E. Sargent, Government Secretary, and Mr. Eadie, an official of the British Ministry of Labour. Mr. Sargent opened with a review of the present system of unemployment relief, pointing out that the number on the register was constantly increasing and that the public work schemes this year had only employed 850 out of 1,434 men who registered, even though £122,000, massive figure in 1927, had been spent on them. Such schemes could not be of lasting nature, and they made no provision for those men who, on account of physical disability, were unable to stand exposure to the weather. He urged the extension of the school age to 15. Quite young, isn't it? Followed in the case of 50 boys per year, boys who had no prospect of permanent employment, by vocational training for 2 years, either at the Nocalo farm or in forestry or at a trade training centre. After the boy had completed his vocational training, the government should defray the cost of his proceeding to Great Britain or to other parts of the empire if he wished to do so. But the encouragement should first be given for the absorption of as many as possible of these improvers with local employers. That sounds quite common to today still, doesn't it? Mr. Sargent pointed out that some of the emigration schemes necessitated the applicant being possessed of a certain sum of money. He suggested that grants should be made where necessary to provide the emigrant with such a sum. To 1936 now, Friday, December the 18th in the Examiner again, and we're told unemployment paid down by fewer men this winter. The latest unemployment returns show that the problem of unemployment continues to be less acute this winter, that's the winter of 1936, than for many years. Up to Saturday last, the number of men in all parts of the island who sought admission to the unemployment register was 2,028, and the number of acceptances 1,824. The figures on the corresponding day last year were 2,185 and 1,995 respectively. The number of men taken from the register for employment was 1,161, 45 less than on the corresponding day last year. The figures which most truly reflect the employment situation, however, reveal a definite all-round improvement on last year. These figures are those relating to unemployment pay, and they show that the number of men who drew unemployment pay last weekend was 76 less than on the corresponding day in 1935, the actual figures being 497 against 573. And a picture at the top of that of King George's Park, a picture of Bellevue in a state of flood following the heavy rain last weekend. Good to see some things change, but the rain has been a constant on the Isle of Man for at least 100 years, probably several hundred years. Staying in 1936 in the Examiner, Friday, October the 16th in this case, the island's biggest problem, Deemster Cowley on unemployment. Supports apprenticeship schemes, I think we heard of earlier. Raising of school leaving age would do good. And unemployment insurance, mentioned earlier, impracticable, we're told. A masterly survey of the Isle of Man's post-war unemployment problem and some suggestions for its future alleviations were made by His Honour the Deemster Cowley on Wednesday. That's post-First World War, of course, when he spoke at the opening meeting of the Manx Dilettante Debating Society in Chatsworth House, Bucks Road in Douglas. Are they still going, the Dilettante Debating Society? When I came to consider a cure for unemployment, said His Honour at one point in his address, I have to confess to a feeling of impotency. I think that some degrees of seasonal employment is inevitable, although there is still some possibility of improvement. His Honour, who made it clear that all his statements were expressions of purely personal opinions, did not think the scheme of unemployment insurance as previously propounded was practicable in the island, and his conclusion was that the present system was the best method of dealing with the problem, although he admitted it had very serious defects. He warmly supported a scheme to enable boys to become apprenticed to skill trades. If you can actually get an apprenticeship these days, of course. At the outset of his address, which lasted around an hour, the Deemster pointed out that the island's unemployment problem differed very much from England's. Over here, it was not due to periodic cycles of trade, but was definitely annual, seasonal and recurring. The island required so much excessive labour in the summer, not anymore I don't think, that they were bound to be faced with some degree of unemployment every winter, and the degree was accentuated in comparison with other resorts whose nearness to the industrial areas enabled some of their surplus labour to be absorbed. And I remember even when I was growing up, the winter work schemes were still in place for seasonal workers who had no work in the winter, would go and work on the roads or on the railways perhaps and such like, doing clearing work. The article goes on, an outlet in pre-war days. Continuing, His Honour said that up to the time of the war, there was always a good outlet for the island's surplus labour across the water, but the prevailing unemployment in England had curtailed the possibility of relief in that direction. Furthermore, the present insular boom in the building trade was to a certain extent being offset by mechanised labour being used for preparing materials for house building, and the visiting industry, which created the problem of unemployment in the first instance, added to it by the number of blind alley occupations which it offered. Prior to 1924-1925, the Deemster went on, there was no official record of unemployment in the Isle of Man, although it was true that as far back as 1921-22, some attempt was made to deal with the problem of the provision of public works, the sum of £54,000 having been spent on the island's roads in that year. In the following year, the expenditure rose to £60,000, and in 1923-24, the sum expended was £69,000. But in 1924-25, a 5-year scheme of road development was undertaken, and while some of the work done was necessary in the ordinary course of events, efforts were practically doubled to deal with winter unemployment. It's amazing, yes, just before the early 20s, there was no record of unemployment on the island at all. The Green Final, Saturday, November the 4th, 1939, just after the Second War had broken out. Unemployment returns. Unemployment returns compiled up to the latest available date show that the number of applications received for admission to the unemployment register are 1,732, compared with 1,959 on the corresponding day last year. Very high figures compared to the figures today, of course. Other details, with the 1938 figures in parentheses, are as follows. The number of men admitted to the registry, 1,564, and the other figure, 1,708. The number of men taken from employment, 623 compared to 114. And the number of men drawing unemployment pay, 741 as opposed to none. Returning to the Isle of Man Times, Saturday, December the 15th, 1945. So we've skipped to the other end of the Second War now. Unemployment amongst Manxmen, the article is entitled. Help on English scale legalised. No help for women yet. New promise of later consideration. The new scheme for employment registration and the distribution of unemployment pay to men who cannot obtain work was approved by Tynwald on Tuesday. At the present time, ex-servicemen are receiving unemployment pay of the same amount as would be paid to them if they'd lived in England and were entitled to unemployment insurance benefit, and one thing which this scheme does is to make those payments regular. The principal conditions which are to entitle a man to unemployment pay were explained by the Attorney General and are as follows. He must be under 65, which is the age for the contributory old age pension, and over 18 if he served in HM forces, or over 21 if he has not. He must have legal settlement in the island. Counted in the years in which he has lived in the Isle of Man will be those in which he served in the forces, provided he was permanently living in the island in 1939, when war broke out, of course. He must be capable of and available for work. He's regarded as capable if he is able to perform work ordinarily done under contracts for employment under conditions in which employees habitually work, or in which he himself has habitually worked. He is regarded as available if he is willing to accept without delay any offers of suitable employment. For the purpose of becoming or keeping fit for regular employment, a man may be required to attend a course, and if he does not attend, or he is expelled for misbehaviour, he loses his right to unemployment pay. A man is not entitled to unemployment pay if, being an ex-serviceman, he is on leave with pay and allowances. And then it goes on, unemployment pay and earnings. Ordinarily, a man is not entitled to unemployment pay if receiving pay or profit from some occupation, but he may still draw the unemployment pay if the occupation is one which he could ordinarily have followed in his off times, and the amount he receives does not average more than 3 shillings and 4 pence a day. The Attorney General mentioned as illustrations a man doing a little painting or gardening. Unemployment pay will not be given to a man who is out of work through participating in a trade dispute. It will be given if he is out of work through someone else's dispute. It will not be given if the man is receiving sickness or disablement benefit under the health insurance schemes. And in the article later on, in what's quite a lengthy article, there's a subheading, Can Girls Be Forced into Domestic Service? Mr. Hampton raised the same point, referring to large number of invalid old people who could not get help, and to the hospitals and sanatoria. Would women registering for employment be subject to direction, and was domestic service one of the occupations into which they could be directed? The point ought to be made clear, he said. He doubted if direction could be made effective. He was afraid that the present crisis was largely manufactured, and there was no real need for the scheme. Employers were at their wits' end, not merely to get new labour, but to keep the labour they had. He'd been accosted during the last 2 months by 7 men who said they wanted a job. When he asked if they had registered, their reply was not very respectful to the labour exchange, and showed they were not interested in the institution. He sent them all to places where they could get the job for which they were employable, a good job, not too much exposed to the hazards of weather. Only 1 man went, and he was in the job now. 1949, so 4 years later, in the Isle of Man Times, Saturday, October the 15th, Peel Commissioners. Serious unemployment problems, we're told. The unemployment problems in the West was again discussed at a meeting of the Peel Commissioners held on Wednesday, when Mr. Leslie Dawson presided. The matter was raised when Mr. R.E. Cottier moved a recommendation from the Works Committee that the Peel Commissioners recommend to the Municipal Association that the whole question of unemployment in the Isle of Man be considered at the next general meeting of the association, and that a resolution to this effect be framed and submitted by the Peel Commissioners. The chairman said, especially now that men's weekly fee was 9 shillings and a penny per week for social security, the whole question of employment for all men was a national matter. It was not the responsibility of the Peel Commissioners to provide unemployment schemes to make work for unemployed men. Mr. J.E. Quirk said the Commissioners had been asked by Government Office to produce schemes of development, but the unemployment problem was certainly kept in mind when these development schemes were planned. In 1953, in the Isle of Man Times, Saturday, January the 24th, unemployment figures, unemployment returns for the week ending January the 14th, show a drop of 10 to 854, still considerably higher than today, in the number paid unemployment benefit, and a £1,623 paid out. The number paid benefit in the corresponding week of last year was 502. They received £725, 9 shillings and 6pence. The full returns are as follows. Number registered, 2,320 compared to 1,725 the previous year. Private employment, 1,109. Employed by boards and local authorities, 358. Available for employment, manual work, 740. Light work, 68. Number paid benefit, 854. And amount paid in benefit, £1,623, 13 shillings and twopence. And finally, 1957, 4 years later, in the Times of Friday, May the 3rd, unemployment figures are still slightly down on last year. Now, much more akin to today's, in fact. There were 408 persons jobless for the weekend of the 24th of April, compared with 426 in 1956. Of these, 304 were paid £737 in benefit, as against 324 being paid £790 for the corresponding period last year. Those entering employment, however, were down on 1956, this year's figure of 38 being 15 lower than that for the period in 1956. Registered during the week as unemployed, 90 persons, an increase of 12 on last year's 78. Unemployment oft to be seen in the Manx papers, and it has to be said that the current figures, as they have been for the last year or two, are pretty low compared to a lot of the historical figures we've seen there over the last century. Safe to say, unemployment in the papers is definitely news today, and of course old news. Till next week, cheerio. You're gonna be yesterday's news.